so long.
Okay, we'll call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting of the Municipal Council, and it's a regulatory public meeting. Call the meeting to order at 6:30 on Thursday, September the 5th. Second order of business on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Chair is looking for a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Have a mover, Councillor Cameron, and a seconder, please. Deputy Mayor Deschamps. Those in favor of the motion, please signify.
Aye.
That motion is carried. And item number 3 on the agenda is disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof. Are there any disclosures here this evening?
None by me.
Okay, so now I'll move on, and this is the regulatory portion of the public meeting. This is a public meeting under Section 17 of the Planning Act regarding an update to the Township Official Plan. The purpose of the meeting is to provide an opportunity for Council to receive input from the public and stakeholders in respect of the proposed draft official plan. If there is anyone present who would like a copy of the public meeting notice, the clerk has extra copies at the front. I will now call on the Community Development Coordinator to outline how notice of this meeting was given.
Notice of this public meeting was given through posting the public meeting notice in the Prescott Journal newspaper. Notice of this public meeting was also given via the Township's website, by mail to each of the prescribed public agencies as required by the Planning Act, and to those who made a written request to the Township to be notified of this public meeting.
So please note that after the adoption of the official plan by Council of the Township of Edwardsburg Cardinal, the plan will be forwarded to the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville, as the counties is the approval authority for the official plan. If you wish to be notified of the decision of the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville on the proposed official plan amendment, you must make a written request to the Township of Edwardsburg Cardinal. Any person wanting further notice of the adoption of the proposed official plan should leave their full name and address with the clerk or the deputy clerk prior to leaving the meeting this evening. Now, if a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision of the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville to the local planning appeal tribunal, but the person or public body does not make an oral submission at a public meeting or make written submissions to the Township of Edwardsburg Cardinal before the official plan is adopted, that person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the Township of Edwardsburg Cardinal before the proposed official plan is adopted, that person or public body may not be added as a party to the hearing of an appeal before the local planning appeal tribunal, unless, in the opinion of the tribunal, there are reasonable grounds to add that person or public body as a party. Is there anybody here tonight who wishes to make comments regarding the draft official plan? And I'm going to leave that question standing, and there will be a presentation by the planner, and then I'll come back to that question at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to call now on Mr. Steve Pence, who is our official planner from Novatech, and I'll ask Mr. Pence to make his presentation. If you would, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here tonight to talk to Council and to those members of the public regarding the official plan program that we've undertaken over the last several months. I'm also happy to answer any questions when I'm done my presentation, so that you can have all your comments and questions directed at me and through writing. If you haven't signed in, we encourage you to do so, so that you have the ability to be notified of any further meetings that may occur. But I think where I'd like to start with here is just to give a little bit of context for what an official plan is, why we undertake this exercise from time to time, and also to kind of talk about the process that we've gone through over these last few months, and some of the changes that we've introduced through this official plan amendment, and finally, where we go from here. So it shouldn't take too much time, and I think I'd prefer to take the questions at the end of the presentation. So first off, what is an official plan? This might sound like a mouthful, but really an official plan is a long-term planning statement of the municipality expressed through a combination of policies and maps that we commonly refer to as schedules that provide guidance and direction for future development, land use, and public infrastructure investment. And what I mean by that is that it's a set of policies that inform developers, residents, anybody interested in development in the community, what sorts of rules there are regarding development of property. The township's current official plan was adopted and approved in 2010, so it's a number of years old. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about why we have to go through this. But one of the key points I want to make sure everybody understands tonight is that an official plan is a guiding document. It's not like a zoning bylaw where you have to adhere to specific zoning provisions. It's a document that we don't even turn to, we don't even crack the cover of an official plan if you don't have a development application before the township. So in other words, if you are simply wanting to get a building permit and you comply with the zoning bylaw with respect to the zone and general provisions, you don't even turn to the official plan for any purpose. So it's not a scary document in the sense that it affects your day-to-day, but it is a guiding document that we turn to for guidance when we make decisions about the future growth of the municipality. So why do we need an official plan? I started talking a little bit about this, but I'll go through these points. First off, it lets the public know the township's general land use planning policies and how specific parcels of land may be used now and in the future. So what I mean by that is that every parcel of land has a specific designation. Some of those designations are very permissive in the sense that they tell you can do industrial use on this property, or you can do residential uses. Or it could be a designation for a provincially significant wetland, which is effectively a land use that doesn't permit any development. So we'll talk about those in a few minutes when we get there. It helps to ensure that growth is coordinated and meets the community needs, including those related to the provision of various public services and roads. So it talks a little bit about infrastructure, where we see roads developing if that's the case, where we anticipate future growth might occur. We'll talk a little about that in a few minutes as well. It provides an important policy framework for the establishment of various land use regulations and controls, such as the zoning bylaw and site plan control. The zoning bylaw and site plan control, those are the sort of the on-the-ground tools that the municipality has to dictate on a day-to-day basis how development occurs. Both of those documents, by the way, take direction from the official plan. So when the township is done with the official plan project, there's an obligation within 3 years to undertake an update to the zoning bylaw. And that document, quite frankly, is when people really start to get interested in what it means for their individual properties, because it sets out things like yard requirements and how much of your lot you can develop, and very specific with respect to what kinds of uses you can do. So the official plan informs how that document will shape up. And another important point here is that the official plan implements the land use policies of higher levels of government, specifically the province of Ontario and the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville. All municipalities in the province are obligated to conform to an upper tier municipal official plan. So in the case of this township and other townships within the United Counties, they're obligated to conform to the United Counties official plan. So there's a lot of repetitiveness in this, but that's unfortunately the way the system works. Both the township and the county's plan are obligated to be consistent with the provincial policy statement. That's the province's expression of what they feel is interesting or important to them from a land use planning point of view, and so we need to be sure that we're consistent with those policies. So all that to say is that we have the ability to craft some of our own policies that apply locally, but we have to be consistent in conformity with those higher tier levels of government. And sometimes that means that we don't have a lot of flexibility in how we deal with certain land uses. So why review an official plan? Well, I'll go through these quickly. First off, is to update the official plan, because since the current official plan was approved, a number of things have happened. For instance, the United Counties developed their first official plan. The province came out with an updated provincial policy statement. Conservation authorities developed a source water protection plan. Those are the kinds of documents that all local lower tier municipal official plans have to have regard to. So we're updating this plan to make sure that we're incorporating the interests of those documents into this township's plan. So I kind of covered the first two there. The third one is to update planning policies to reflect current information and trends. So over time, things change. So we might find that through this last 10-year period or so, there's a need to change a little bit of the direction in the way the official plan has been working. It's also an opportunity to identify weaknesses or deficiencies in the current plan. So through experience in working with the official plan, we might find that certain policies don't work very well, that we have the opportunity to revise those to the extent that we can. And finally, introduce and revise policies to address local interests that may have developed in recent years. So similar to the last point, over the last number of years, we may find that we have an interest in sort of taking a slightly different direction with respect to a certain land use. And so the update is an opportunity to do that. So the approach that we've taken on this official plan is basically, it's a stay the course update. I put that in quotes because what I mean by that, it's really a plan to deal with matters of provincial interest and county interest. And for the most part, I would say it hasn't changed a lot of the local policy planning context. There's a few instances where it has, but for the most part, it's really maintaining the philosophy and direction of the existing official plan. When the existing plan was developed, there was a task force or a stakeholder group that was charged with developing sort of the guiding principles. Those principles are still intact, so we haven't taken a real departure from that philosophy. Only where there's been a need to reflect provincial and United Counties interests. Examples of that might be with respect to things like wetlands and aggregates and wildland fire. And I'll talk about those things in just a few minutes. So again, the updates are focused largely on provincial policy interests and United Counties policy requirements. So the process to date has been, it kind of started with an initial kickoff meeting back in June of 2018. That was a statutory public meeting held in this room. We invited a number of, we advertised probably in the same manner that we did for tonight's meeting. Had people come out, suggest to us the kinds of things they felt needed to be addressed through this plan. So that was a kickoff meeting. The township chose to use the Community Development Committee as sort of a steering committee in the development of these revisions. And so through input from them, I met a number of times with the committee to review earlier drafts, to refine those policies, to answer questions, and to get to the point we are today. There's been considerable consultation with the United Counties. We've had consultation with the Conservation Authority as well as other agencies as well. Some of you may recall there was an open house here in August of this year. That was an informal session. There was no formal presentation from myself, but we had all the land use plans set up. There's an opportunity for people to, to discuss with me concerns that they had, ask any questions, and get answers to those things. We've reviewed all the comments that we've received, and we made decisions on whether or not those comments triggered a need to revise the plan, or if they were just more sort of questions or comments that didn't need to be addressed. So we made a decision in consultation with the committee. And then here we are tonight. This is a statutory public meeting under the Planning Act, where it's before council, and we ask for comments from the public. And subject to those comments that we received tonight, there could be further revisions to the plan, or the plan could be adopted at any point in the future by council. So this slide here is really, I don't want to go through the whole plan, there's several pages to it, but I thought I would take the time here to highlight a few things that I felt were worth mentioning. So when I talk about mapping, I'm talking about the schedules. There's two land use schedules in the current plan. There's a Schedule A, which is a land use schedule, and a Schedule B, which is a constraints schedule. Nothing's changed with that structure, but they've been updated. And for the most part, I'm going to talk about those in just a moment on my next slide, but we've also created a couple appendices. One is an appendix that deals with wildland fire, that's provincial interest. I think that's something I'm going to be talking about here in a minute. And Appendix B, which deals with Algonquin traditional territory interests, and that again comes from the province's mandate. The structure of the plan, as I was saying, overall remains intact. Shouldn't put it that way, it remains consistent. So we haven't changed any of the land use designations per se. Those designations are all the same. We've had to revise certain policies. For example, in a natural heritage policy designation, that's a designation that deals with provincially significant wetlands. And if you will recall me saying earlier, that's a designation that prevents any sort of development from happening. What we had to do with that policy is we've had to, actually probably not much change with natural heritage in the sense of provincially significant wetlands, but with other features like ANSIs and significant wildlife, we've had to change the adjacent lands policies. And what I mean by that is the policies that deal with land uses around those features to ensure there's protection that's been adequately provided. We've worked a little bit on the aggregate resource policies. So currently there's a designation in the official plan that deals with mineral aggregate. And on Schedule B, which is a constraint schedule, we've really enhanced the extent of bedrock and superficial sand and gravel reserves. We're required to protect those resources for future development. And so we've added a lot of that kind of, you'll see the plan here in a second, but what it does is it makes sure that that resource is protected from development. It doesn't mean you can't develop, but it means that you might have to do a little bit of an assessment before you get approvals to develop within those areas. Archaeological resources, we've had to update those criteria quite considerably since they were first adopted in 2010. The province sets out a number of criteria for when a development application might trigger an archaeological assessment. So those criteria have been reviewed in their entirety and replaced with a new set of criteria. Wildland fire hazards, those are, that's a new thing in the provincial policy statement in 2014. What it is the province has identified the need for municipalities to identify where there are wildland fire hazards to protect development from forest fires. So we've had to incorporate that into the plan somehow. And what we've done is we've added to an appendix, and we've also taken the areas of high and extreme risk and added those to the constraint schedule. You'll see that in a minute. We've updated the we've added source water protection policies, and those have to do with things like the intake protection zone in Cardinal, and the wellhead protection area associated with the Maples apartment in Spencerville here. And what that means is that it gives protection to those areas from land uses developing that would potentially compromise the water that's being drawn through those sources. That was a requirement that all municipal official plans have to conform to the source water protection plan, so that was one of the big things we had to deal with. I've listed a couple things under general development and implementation here. Second units, that's an entirely new section that's been added. What that is it allows anywhere there's a single dwelling or a semi-detached or a townhouse dwelling to add a second unit to the use. So the Planning Act made that a requirement that those types of uses be permitted to have second units. And so we've introduced that to the township, and we will be implementing specific policies for those types of uses through the zoning bylaw. So you wouldn't find any really specific policies in here, other than it enables the municipality to allow second units. And we've enhanced the complete applications section. If you remember at the outset of this presentation, I said that we only can crack the cover of the official plan until we have a planning application in front of us. That's where this comes in. This section basically identifies a whole list of studies that the township could ask for in support of an application, only when there's a development application. So it doesn't require those sorts of things to be listed or provided through a zoning app or a building permit application, only if there was an application under the Planning Act. And I guess the last point here is somewhat important, but it really, as I was saying at the start, this is a stay the course kind of plan. It doesn't change in philosophy too much, but there was some reorganization to kind of make it work. And so the plan has a little bit of a different look and feel, but I think in large part it still has the same structure. So this here, it's hard to read here. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's illegible here. But this is Schedule A. It's no different really than what you have in the current official plan. The only difference is there'd be some marginal differences in some of the wetland areas because those things have changed over time. And down in the Johnstown area where the industrial park is, there's a future industrial park expansion area being designated on the plan as well. But those other designations that you see there, settlement policy, rural policy, agricultural, industrial, highway, commercial, mineral, aggregate, and natural heritage resource, those are the same categories that you have today, and for the most part, those policies haven't changed. Schedule B, this is a very busy schedule, and it doesn't, quite frankly, depart too much from what you have in place today, although there's more. I'll just work through the list. Under the natural heritage constraints, it lists things like significant woodlands, ANSIs, and significant wildlife. Those features are all in the existing plan. What may have changed a little bit are some of the policies regarding adjacent lands, and some of the mapping may have changed based on some more refinement by the province. The second category, hazard constraints. These are the kinds of constraints that could affect development if you're under the influence of one of those constraints. So things like floodplain, organic soils, abandoned mines, waste disposal, and wildland fire hazard potential. So all those things, with the exception of the wildland fire hazard potential, are all in your current official plan. And we've just had to refine some of those policies to meet provincial requirements where they've changed. Some of the mapping will have changed slightly as well. Only, I guess, with respect to the floodplain. And of course, the wildland fire hazard potential is new. Source water protection, we've identified the source water protection areas, one being in Spencerville and one in Cardinal. So those are now on the schedule. And mineral bedrock resources, that's all the brown that you see on there. Kind of shows up as maybe a reddish brown on the screen at the top there. But those are areas of potential bedrock and superficial gravel reserves. There's a requirement for the municipality to protect those types of resources for future development. And we don't have the ability to really come up with a scientific approach to determine whether those are all legitimate or not. But we've used published mapping to come with our best estimate of where those resources are. And we've applied a filter to try and limit the extent of it throughout the township. The way the policy reads is that we anticipate that as the county produces their aggregate master plan, we will take that information and make decisions as to whether or not we will have to revise this schedule with respect to those resources. So the policy is written such that there is lots of flexibility in the way we apply that policy, and that we anticipate that some of those will disappear one day and some might become formal designations on the land use schedule. These are the two appendices. You can see on the left-hand side, that is the wildland fire hazard potential. There's really only a very few, you can't see them on the screen, I don't think, but there's very few extreme and high potential areas. All the green that you see there is unclassified. But we've basically taken the mapping provided to us from the counties and just put it on a schedule, or sorry, on an appendix rather, and written a policy to deal with that. And the second one you see on the right, that's just showing what the Algonquins have identified as their traditional territory. Through our consultative process with the counties and with the Aboriginal groups, we were asked to include this kind of schedule or appendix in the plan. What it does is it identifies the Algonquin traditional territory, and the policy simply gives them recognition and might require consultation with that agency if there's a development application. So next steps, as I was saying at the outset here, is that we'll review any comments that we've received as of the release of this last version, the public meeting draft. We anticipate that the adoption of the official plan by the township will occur sometime this fall. After the official plan has been adopted by council, it will be submitted to the United Counties for approval. So if you wish to be notified of that, you should sign the register that was at the door when you came in, so that when the county issues an approval, they will be sure to let you know that that's happened, and that you, if you have any interest in appealing, then you at least have the ability to do so. As the statements that were made at the outset tonight indicate, you have to participate in the process if you want to have any ability to object. And I guess that's the fourth point there, that once the decision's been taken by the counties, then there's a 20-day appeal period, which any person who makes an appeal to the local planning appeals tribunal would get forwarded on to the board, rather, sorry, to the tribunal, and then proceedings will continue from there. And finally, the township will commence in the preparation of a zoning bylaw following the completion of the official plan, following a similar consultative process. So what I mean by that is that there'll be open houses and public meetings and notice given to anybody about those changes, and that will occur within a 3-year period as we're required to do so. So with that, I'm going to complete my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions from anybody, from council and from the public, and I'll do my best to answer your questions, and I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pence. And so just before we start entertaining questions, and I think because it's a small group here tonight, if you don't mind, we'll do it more or less informally. People wish to ask questions, I won't insist that they come through the chair. I'll let you deal with them directly because it's a small group. I'm sure that everybody will respect the fact that questions really should come through the chair, but we can be a little bit more informal. I guess the one point that I want to emphasize before we get into the question period is that the lead up to tonight's meeting has been a very extensive process. Mr. Pence has appeared before the Community Development Committee at least 3 times that I can recall, and all of that process has been an open and public process when anybody could attend and if necessary or if wanted to make presentations or ask questions. What tends to happen is that we tend to get far down the road with these kinds of processes, and then finally people start to catch on to what's happening. And these are important documents, and I can guarantee you that 4 years from today, somebody will be saying, well, I wasn't notified about this. But let me tell you, we've been through and we've spent the time. So, Mr. Pence, if you'll then take questions directly from the floor, I'll recognize the questioner and have them speak directly to you. So, we'll now provide an opportunity for those wishing to ask any questions regarding the official plan. Are there any questions for Mr. Pence? Okay, now, okay, yes, sir?
Now, just for clarification, with the mineral aggregate reserves and resources, there is a restriction in place of about 500 meters.
Yes.
So what is the background for that? How do you
Okay.
justify that?
Yeah. So the way that works is that around aggregate resources, I'll give you the big picture context here so you know where we're coming from with this. The provincial policy statement has statements that require municipalities to protect aggregate resources for their long-term use. And they also have statements about protecting sensitive land uses from sort of heavy extractive types of uses that they see would be incompatible. So because we have to balance those two types of interests, we have what they call an influence area around resources. The idea is that if you're in that influence area, you may have to assess the impacts you would have on a sensitive land use if you were developing it for resource use, or if you're going to be developing as a sensitive land use, you want to make sure that you don't thwart an opportunity of some future aggregate operator to no longer be able to develop the resource because there's a bunch of sensitive land uses. And so that influence area ranges from anywhere between 300 meters to 500, depending on the resource. So typically with bedrock, that is 500 meters is the resource distance, and that's a guideline from the province. With superficial sands and gravels, it's only 300 meters. So we've applied that principle, and that principle, by the way, is in the current official plan as well. The only difference that we've done in this plan is we've identified more sand and gravel resources on the Schedule B in order to make sure that stuff is utilized. Because when we look at published mapping and mapping from the United Counties plan, it shows a ton of superficial sand and gravel in the township. Most of it's of a tertiary quality, meaning that it's not really high quality, but there's a ton of it. Very few areas are primary and secondary quality uses. So we've identified it, but we didn't want to blanket the township with all this because that really limits the potential for anything to happen. So we've applied a filter to try and pare it back from roads so that it enables someone to get a severance without having to do a study. So in other words, we've taken the bedrock and we've pared it back to 600 meters so that you could have a 100-meter deep lot and still be outside that influence area. And similarly with sand and gravel, we've applied a 400-meter buffer so that you can get a severance, for example, and not have to do a study. If you were developing in those influence areas and you had to do if you were within those influence areas, you could be required to do they call an aggregate impact assessment to evaluate sort of the incompatibility of the two proposed land uses.
So it's kind of a protected buffer.
It's similar to, you may have heard of MDS with respect, like that's relating to agricultural uses. You want to make sure that sensitive land uses like residential uses don't get in the way of farmers being productive and continuing to be productive without hearing nuisance complaints. And vice versa, you don't want somebody to put up a barn beside a residential use because you get, so it's, the idea is to try and make two land uses compatible and maintain a separation between them. And you can justify a reduction to that distance based on a study if you had to do that.
And those restrictions are consistent across Ontario?
A lot of, they are, those are consistent. Some municipalities might take different approaches on how they identify those resources. The way we've done it here is we've taken and built some flexibility into the policy to defer some of that decision-making until the counties has developed a master plan for aggregate protection. I don't think the township has a budget to go off and do all that work themselves, nor should they. If they're obligated to deal with county policies, then the obligation, and in fact, the county's plan says that they are going to do that, so we're kind of deferring that decision-making until that time. So I think it's a very flexible approach, and one that still meets county interest and provincial policy interest.
And Mr. Pence, I think, I don't want to prejudge the county commitment to doing the identification of the resource, the mineral and aggregate resources, but I think the intention of the county program will be to try to get to closer definitions so that those broadly identified areas can be shrunken down to the more pertinent types of and identifiable and easily accessible resources.
That's certainly the hope, yes.
Yes, that's what we're hoping will happen.
Yeah. And that's why we built it as a sort of a flexible policy, so that we have the ability to do that. So some of that brown that I was showing on that plan might disappear altogether, and so it might get translated into a land use designation on Schedule A that actually is a legitimate area for aggregate extraction.
And is there a timetable for that, or is it kind of as we go along?
You know, I wish that was happening already, because it would have been helpful to us going through this process. I think that the plans that they were gonna do it within 3 years of the adoption of their plan, that time has come and they haven't done it yet, so I don't know. But what I would say is that we can't align our program with other levels of government, because we never get anything done if that was the case. So we've done the best we can with what we know, and we can always amend the plan at any time. Just because we have to do this from time to time, doesn't mean we can't do it more regularly.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Pence?
We were sent some questions from a resident earlier today. Steve, do you mind if I read them and maybe have answers?
I can answer those questions if is that the 2-page list of questions?
Yes, yes. So I think we've touched on some of this already, and I could probably go to the questions that maybe haven't been answered already.
Okay.
Are the small and fragmented areas of primary and tertiary significance included in the Schedule B mentioned on page 22? What does potential mean when referring to the aggregates, example, size of deposits? Are they all mapped on Schedule B or just significant deposits?
So Schedule B is a combination of all the tertiary and primary and secondary. But like I said in my presentation, there's very, very few primary and secondary deposits. It's primarily all tertiary. So we've taken that data, we've applied a filter to it, and placed it on the schedule as a potential reserve. It's not a designation. So the important distinction there is a reserve identifies to the public that this is potentially an aggregate deposit that could be viable for future extraction. But at this point, we just want to make sure we don't have development occurring on it to sort of thwart any future potential for that. And so on the Schedule A, we have designations where either there's already a licensed pit or quarry in operation, and or a designation that we know has viable material.
Thank you. Under permitted uses, section 3.6.2.1, agricultural uses are permitted but exclude any accessory building or structure. Does this include barns, machine sheds, garages, etc.?
That's a very good question, and I guess the short answer is yes, it would. The idea is that we don't want development to occur in sort of a manner that would be permanent and then be difficult to deal with in the future. So when they talk about agricultural uses, it's more for sort of pasture land and crop land.
Under section 3.6.3.1, will no new development be permitted unless it can be demonstrated that new development will only be better for the public good? Who will determine the value of the public good?
So that question is referring to a policy that comes directly out of the provincial policy statement. And in fact, I think it's word for word from the PPS. And that policy is talking about protecting the public interest in terms of materials. So if you are developing a site and you can prove that there's no material there, then obviously there's no problem. But if there is material there, you have to be able to justify development versus protection of the resource. So that's the public interest that that's referring to. And so that only gets triggered if you're developing either within a reserve area or adjacent to the reserve area.
Thank you. I have quite a few questions. I need to pause for someone
I'm
else.
just gonna insert one other piece of information here. The audience will have heard Mr. Pence and the Community Development Coordinator referring many times during the presentations to the provincial policy statements. And these provincial policy statements were obligated to, all townships are obligated to adhere to them and to reflect the intent within our plans and within our zoning bylaws. And for quite a number of years, many of us have found those restrictions to be overly onerous and to some extent tie our hands. We know that the existing Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing is conducting a review of the provincial policy statements. But what we don't know at this point in time is how long the review is going to take, or whether the changes to the provincial policy statements will be significant. As a committee, the Community Development Committee that was dealing with this plan, we made the tactical decision to proceed with our plan and to proceed with tonight's open public house, in spite of the fact that that review of provincial policy statements was ongoing. And so that is the position that we're in right now. And you know, council will have to be directed or be guided by both the timing and the extent of the results to the changes to those plans. But our present plan is to proceed with the adoption of this official plan as you see it here this evening. That's the way we're heading. Is that not correct, Mr. Pence?
That has been my advice, is to continue on the path that you set out. Otherwise, you're aligning with an unknown schedule, and you may never be done. If you find that you adopt something and changes are required, well, unfortunately, you have to go back and make those changes. We don't know what the extent of those changes would be. It could be very minimal if there aren't many changes to the PPS, but my recommendation has been to stay
Proceed ahead.
Yes.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Pence? You have another one.
Yep, I still have more from this resident who gave us this letter today. How easy will it be for licenses to be granted for portable asphalt plants and concrete plants once the areas in the official plan are designated for aggregate extraction? Will the public have any input, and will any new zoning bylaws be changed in accordance with the new official plan?
So there's lots of things in there that I'm hearing.
Yeah.
The aggregate designations would allow asphalt plants and concrete plants. But the act of getting those things approved would require, depending on what the zoning is, of course, and the zoning would typically include those as well, because the official plan has given direction to that. And I think the question also asked about approval for other types of aggregate operations, or is it just the?
Well, the next question is, how easy will it be for existing licenses to be changed to include portable or permanent asphalt plants and concrete plants, should these new amendments take place?
Okay, so the policies in the OP are permissive for those types of uses, and the zoning will list them as permitted uses as well then. And so now you wouldn't have those kinds of uses if they weren't related to an aggregate, so you'd have to have the right zoning in place. So depending on the circumstances, there might be a zoning amendment required, but those kinds of uses would be permitted if the zoning was in place.
Should a property be under consideration for a new AR license, will it be up to local residents to provide opposing expert proof to evaluate adjacent properties for the 10 requirements outlined? This is in section 3.6.3.5 These would be cost prohibitive for most residents in the township.
Right, so those criteria that are listed there are meant to cover off the kinds of things that an aggregate operator would have to produce in support of an aggregate license. And aggregate licenses are issued through the Ministry of Natural Resources, so that's a whole set of process outside of the township's mandate. So they would have to produce an aggregate license application package, various studies that get produced and site plans, and all those things that they would produce are probably covered off in that list. How would a resident get engaged in that? They would be informed through the proponent-led aggregate process, and if they had opposition, it would certainly be their responsibility to try and get answers to those kinds of concerns that they have. And in many cases, aggregate license applications also require zoning bylaw amendments, and sometimes official plan amendments as well. So it's a kind of a tough question to answer fulsomely, but the onus on opposing any sorts of aggregate applications is on the onus is on the applicant to make the application, of course, and anybody who opposes it to defend their position.
Thank you. In section 3.6.3.8, will residents surrounding proposed AR development be notified personally when applications for aggregate licenses are requested?
So the answer is yes, they would, depending on how close they are. The aggregate resources license process is different than a zoning amendment process because it's proponent-led. So in other words, the applicant has to follow the rules set out by the provincial standards under the Aggregate Resources Act, and it would require them giving notice to residents, posting in the newspaper, posting a sign on the property. All sounds very similar to what goes on for a zoning amendment, but it's slightly different and it's proponent-led. It's not something that they make an application to the township for.
Thank you. I have one last question. In section 3.6.3.9, will new licenses protect existing residents, daycares, educational, and health facilities by the 150 meter, 300 meter, and 500 meter requirements? Who determines incompatible for reasons of public health, public safety, or environmental impact, and what does this mean to the public?
Another very interesting question. Those influence areas that we talk about in the official plan also get carried through into the zoning bylaw. So that it's conceivable that you see in the zoning bylaw something like, a policy says no new dwelling within 300 meters of a licensed pit. The idea there is that you couldn't build a house within a distance of a pit, and vice versa, you couldn't do your pit within 300 meters of a house. So unless you did the requisite studies to support a reduction of that distance. So to answer the question about who makes that decision, whether the public interest is being considered, it falls a lot to the municipality and to the ministry when reviewing things like aggregate license applications in terms of blast impacts, noise impacts, traffic, environmental, and so on and so forth. So it's a complex process. Lots of studies involved, and the hope is that at the end of the day, a balance of interests is able to be managed.
Thank you.
And I guess there's one other piece of information that I would kind of like to insert at this point as well. In the earlier monologue introducing the meeting, we referred to appeals to the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal. Many folks in the room may remember and have heard various appeals that went to the Ontario, it's called the Ontario Municipal Board, wasn't it? Yes. Ontario Municipal Board, OMB. So again, just to put things in context, about 2 years ago, the Ontario Municipal Board was stood down in favor of this new mechanism called the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal, which was designed to act quicker and more efficiently than the Ontario Municipal Board had been acting. Now, they've had some trouble getting the local planning appeals tribunals up and running, but they are working. And there is now some swing back to referring some issues to the Ontario Municipal Board. But for the people in this room that heard all of the dialogue referring to the local planning appeals tribunal, you can think that that used to be called the Ontario Municipal Board, roughly.
And my understanding is that the name won't change, but the way they operate, the way appeals are handled are more akin to the way the OMB operated.
Right. So I'll ask one last time, go around a couple more times. Are there any other questions for Mr. Pence or to council?
Just a confirmation, I understand that within 3 years, there will be a new official plan.
It'll be a lot sooner than that.
Oh, okay.
It'll probably be within 3 months. Now, give or take a month. That's and that's a new official plan for the township, and that's the plan that we're presenting here this evening. One last chance. Does anybody else have any questions for either Mr. Pence or council? Okay, if not, then, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for coming here this evening and for showing interest in the process and for participating in the process. Council will consider all of the comments which have been made here this evening prior to adoption of the official plan. And maybe just back to Mr. Pence for one last question, or perhaps to the CAO. Do we have a timeline for when the final adoption of the official plan will come before council prior to being submitted to the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville? Do we have a timeline for that? If we do, I've just forgotten it off the top of my head. Can you help me out, Madam CAO, or the...
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I believe the intent is that this final draft, provided it doesn't need any further adjustments, could be in front of council as soon as September 23rd.
Okay, which will be the last meeting of the month. And then following adoption by council at that meeting, assuming that there are no changes as a result of tonight's meeting and there haven't been any questions that would lead to changes that I've heard, then council will adopt it, and then we will submit it to the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville. They are the approval authority for the township's official plan. They will have the official plan under review for probably something like 30 to 60 to 90 days. And at that point, they will approve it, and there will be a 21-day appeal period. So that's the process, and if anybody wants any more detail, and I'm explaining it rather briefly, the Community Development Coordinator has the detail.
And that was the kind of breakdown I was looking for.
Okay. Mr. Pence wanted it again.
One thing that I forgot to mention was that one piece that we're missing from the plan that I think will dictate the timing of the completion is some mapping that we've requested from the Conservation Authority, updated floodplain mapping. Doesn't change the policies or anything, because the policies I think are there. We just need to replace the mapping with more current mapping. So once we have that piece, then we'll be able to insert that onto the schedule, and then the plan will be complete. I don't foresee a lot of changes as a result of this process. We received some late comments from the railway company that might require a couple words, but I'd also like to hear back from the counties and the Conservation Authority on this final draft that is presented, just so that we're comfortable that they're not going to have concerns with what's being adopted.
Okay, now are you indicating to us that let me rephrase this, get my thoughts in order here. Are you suggesting to us that waiting for that information would delay council adoption at the end of the month?
It could, yes.
It could.
And I would prefer to have some acknowledgement on those three items.
Before it comes to council?
Just so that we know that we don't, because one thing that could happen is that if the county felt there were things missing, they could modify the plan through their decision. That's not the end of the world, but I would prefer to have it kind of in a position where they don't have any further comments to make, rather than modifying it, because that, you know, I think, yeah.
So what Mr. Pence is saying is that if it doesn't come before council at the last meeting of September, the council meeting of September, which is the fourth Monday in September, if he hasn't got it in its final schedules, and we'll call it window dressing, I guess that's basically what it is, because the policies don't change. If it doesn't get to council by the fourth Monday of September, it'll probably be the fourth Monday of October. But you can track that through the Community Development Coordinator if you want to just check with her. She's got updated maps or something to add to the final version. So, if there are no other questions and no other comments, I think everybody's aware of the process. I want to thank you one more time for coming. And now the chair's looking for the motion to adjourn the meeting. Do I have a mover to adjourn the meeting?
I have it here.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hunter.
Moved myself, second by Deputy Mayor Deschamps. The municipal council does now adjourn at 7:28 p.m.
Thank you very much, Council. You've heard the motion. Those in favor, please signify. Motion is carried. Thank you. Meeting is adjourned.